Today we are finishing the chapter on kinship and specifically concentrating on marriage and family in kinship and trying to understand that. I want to start out by breaking out the anthropological kinship chart for a second here to remind us of how these worked and to think about the role of descent in your kinship and your ideas. So we'll start off with a little bit about descent. I forgot to say something in the last class, which is about how we feel we are related to each other in terms of descent, and why in the United States we tend to start our kinship charts in landscape mode. We talked a little bit about that when I tried to get you to tell me how many parents you had, and then we went through grandparents and great-grandparents, and we did that little multiplication exercise, and you probably thought, why are we doing this? I know how many grandparents I have, or I'm supposed to have. So I want to talk about that a little bit more, because what I forgot to say is that in a typical bilateral system, we feel that we are related equally to our parents on our mother and father's side, and that equal relationship extends backwards into the generations. And so as we go back, our kinship chart gets wider and wider, but we can't remember too far back, because once we get back to 3 or 4 generations, we're talking about 32 possible relatives that we might have to remember there. And if we're equally related to them, even though we have that patrilineality in our last name sometimes, we are certainly going to multiply those. So there are very few people in the United States who could name a relative in the 4th or 5th generation back. But if we lived in a matrilineal society or a patrilineal society in which what was of primary importance were the relations on either your mother's side or on your father's side, and the other side was, you may feel like you're related to them, but maybe not very much, maybe not at all, in fact, and so they would not be that important to your lineage and to your inheritance and to all those things. And especially if you are in a situation which we can think about a little bit with regard to the film we watched, Maasai Women, and also is discussed in the Lavenda and Schultz, in what is called a patrilocal or a matrilocal society. So in a patrilocal society, if you are the spouse, the wife goes to live with the lineage of her husband. And so in that society, you'd end up with several generations potentially living in the same arrangement, and it would be actually quite easy for you to remember back 4 or 5 or 6 generations, because you'd only be remembering one side or one lineage. And so if we lived in a matrilineal or a patrilineal society, you probably would do your kinship chart vertically, because you could name back 4 or 5 generations probably from memory without much trouble. And so again, this is an illustration of how people can construct differently, and it's that classic anthropological idea of kinship, that it is done differently and classified differently in different parts of the world. And 3 of the major arrangements, at least in regard to descent, are bilateral kindreds, matrilineals, and patrilineal arrangements. And so it makes for a very different, or potentially very different, reckoning of kin. So I wanted to talk about that. And then in our society, we tend to prioritize something that are called neolocal marriages. And so in a patrilocal relationship, you would marry and go to your father's kindred, or I guess the husband's kindred. And in a matrilocal society, the husband would go live with the wife's family. But in our society, or in US society, we have tended to idealize what is called the neolocal, or the new. So supposedly when you get married, you are supposed to create a new household, a neolocal arrangement. And we have we tend to idealize this arrangement, which is, married people, 2.14 children living in their own separate house. And this is known as the nuclear family, which is the idea that the nuclear comes from the idea of the nucleus, that this is the basic unit of kinship. And so a neo-local monogamous relationship, and in US society, we have an average of, I don't know, 2.14 children and a dog. And so this becomes a kind of cultural ideal in our society. Now, some of you in their comments said that Lavenda and Schultz make it sound bad. I don't know if they intended to make it sound bad. They talk about jealousy among siblings in this relationship, but they also talk about jealousy in different forms of family relationships. I think to the extent that they might be making it sound bad, it may be because they're trying to get us to think differently about what has become a kind of standard or an ideal, and something that has been assumed to be universal across human societies, and that we assume that everyone desires this arrangement or everyone wants to live in them. The nuclear family creates some very intense bonds, and it concentrates that power between a very small number of people. And so it's a very intense and powerful relationship, but they also tend to be quite fragile in terms of when they are under stress, there's not much support from other places. And so it creates an intense amount of pressure, especially on the parents here. And so in some societies, they would prefer to idealize something more like what Lavenda and Schultz call on page 458, extended families. And so in an extended family, you would have maybe grandparents or a third generation living with the family. They also mentioned joint families, which would extend out to either brothers or sisters in the same household. But the extended family is something that a lot of people find to provide a decent amount of support within a society. And so a lot of people in the United States actually, in some ways, they live close to a grandparent, or they're close if not actually living themselves in an extended family, they actually might live nearby. So this is definitely has been an ideal for US society. Lavenda and Schultz mentioned an interesting figure, and I believe the numbers have actually declined a little bit since even 2013. So even at 2013, about half of the children who are under 18 live in a nuclear family. So it is actually not the most numerically prevalent family form, even in the United States, even where it is idealized. But it certainly has, it certainly is a form that you see in many different parts of the world, and has been, in some cases, idealized in certain societies. So this is what we get when we have what most of us know of as the neo-local, the new living arrangements for a monogamous relationship, and that there would only be 2 generations in the same house. So from there, we want to go into something that several of you commented on, the idea of what forms of marriage we probably know, and forms of marriage that we are perhaps less familiar with. So gamus being the suffix that means marriage. We all know about monogamy, or being married to one person. And that is the law here in the United States. And it is also, if we sort of did a cross-cultural or survey of different societies, it's going to be the majority of marriages in most societies are what are this form of monogamy. Polygamy comes from the idea of being able to be married to more than one person. When we think of, in the United States, usually when we think of polygamy, we actually usually think of one kind of polygamy. There's two different kinds. The one that we think of first is actually technically known as polygyny, which is one man being married to more than one woman. And this is perhaps one of the reasons we think about this first, and some people just call this polygamy, is that it is a permissible form in the majority of the world's societies. So most societies permit this, and some even idealize it as a form of marriage. Like I said, though, the majority of marriages, even in those societies that permit polygyny, are going to be monogamous. And for various reasons, even though it may be permissible, it's something that is often only practiced by the wealthiest in that place. So because it is actually a very costly thing to have, in many places you have to provide equals. The husband would have to provide equal financial support. In some cases, even there are ideas of equal emotional support for each wife. And so it is something that is only, in some ways, is done by the top. It solves an issue, or it helps to solve the issue of accumulating labor. If in a place where people are wanting to have a lot of resources, but not a lot of labor, it's something that can increase the labor supply, as we saw in the Maasai women film. The idea of having to do so much, and that the co-wives would be able to help you out with the chores around the village. Now, we usually get into, I guess these things often come tinged with a kind of moral hue to them, and we get into this idea that certain forms of marriage are inherently immoral. To that, I think, when we think back on our own society, people would ask from societies that permit more than one, a person to be married to more than one person, they might ask us, well, do you really, in your society, in US society, do you have monogamy, or is it what we call serial monogamy? Which is to say that people are married to one person at a time. And so this is a kind of relationship system that you may be familiar with from college. You're with one person for a time, and then you move on to another person. And so in our society, we seem to have a number of people who have become more into serial monogamy than into monogamy. And this leads to what Lavenda and Schultz and other anthropologists, sociologists call blended families, which is to say that other people are bringing in children from previous marriages, and then it creates, new possibilities. In some cases, people get along, and in other cases, new tensions, new forms of relating. And they make a rather kind of curious statement that in some ways the blended families start to look like some of the polygynous families that they describe when they're talking about the polygynous family. So in some ways, we may not want to completely we may learn from societies that are doing things that formally look very different to us. In practical terms, this may be less unfamiliar than it first appears. What is probably strange to us, in part because it is the it is technically the rarest formal form of marriage that is practiced is polyandry, where a woman is married to more than one man at a time. And like I said, in terms of societies that have formal polyandry as a permissible marriage form, it's not very many. The most famous cases are in Highland Tibet and Nepal, where it's known as, it's usually considered to be fraternal polyandry, or when a woman is marrying several brothers. And what this marriage system seems to solve are problems with inheritance and dividing up land. And so if you have a situation in which there are three brothers and they're trying to preserve their family land and not divide it up, this is a marriage system which can, in some ways, resolve that issue. But like I said, it's a very rare form of formal marriage, and it brings with it its own issues, for sure. There are some people who believe, there was an article that I sometimes assign for this class called "When Taking Multiple Husbands Makes Sense." And what this author does is review some anthropologists who say that certainly as a formal mode of marriage, polyandry is quite rare, but in various societies, it does come up as a way in which women, especially potential mothers, can get more resources for their children. So this is something that some people have argued is not quite as rare in human history as some anthropologists have told us it is, if you looked at the kind of what you might call less formal arrangements that people make in order to care for their offspring and form different kinds of families. So going back to the idea of marriage, I want to step into the definition that Lavenda and Schultz give us of a prototypical marriage. So this is on page 449, and it's kind of interesting to read the definition, or what they call toward the definition of marriage, a prototypical marriage. So a prototypical marriage, number one, transforms the status of the participants. Number two, stipulates the degree of sexual access the married partners are expected to have to each other, ranging from exclusive to preferential. Number three, perpetuates social patterns through the production or adoption of offspring. Number four, creates relationships between the kin of the partners. And number five is symbolically marked in some way, from an elaborate wedding to simply the appearance of a husband and wife seated one morning outside her hut. So we have the transform the status, degree of sexual access, perpetuating social patterns, creates relationships. What's missing from that? When you think of marriage, I've just read you 5 different things in a prototypical marriage. What do we think of as the crucial ingredient to marriage, which is missing from our list? What's missing from that definition of marriage?
No, the list.
Can I repeat the list? Oh, I can't repeat the whole list, but I'll try. It transforms the status of the participants, stipulates degree of sexual access, perpetuates social patterns through offspring. So it legitimates offspring, creates relationships between kin and partners, and has symbolic marking. What's missing? What do we think? Why are you going to get married? Because of love. Missing is love. Where'd the love go, man? Come on. Seems like it's missing from this marriage, right? We want to think of ourselves as getting married because of love. And it brings up the point. So the idea that love, romantic love, falling in love, is the basis for getting married is actually a relatively recent idea in human history. And it kind of starts to come up in some of those wonderful novels of the 19th century of, Jane Austen and wanting to get married for companionate marriage or for love. And in some ways, this is opposed to the ideas of the time of being in somewhat different kinds of arranged marriages. Now, in all, I'll say in all human societies, there are ideas of love, falling in love, romance, all those things exist. But in most societies, they would say that those are far too fragile. They're far too ephemeral to base your marriage on. And so they would say, you want to get married you can fall in love eventually with the person you get married, but you would never base a marriage on love. Love is too wishy-washy. You don't want to base things on love. And we can wonder if our marriage is based on love are working that well. So the point here is that marriage does a lot of different things, and it often has to do in many different societies with organizing resources, legitimating offspring, making sure inheritance patterns follow the way they should, making political alliances with others. So some of you commented on things like bride wealth and dowries and stuff like that, and asked, well, do we still do that today? Well, not exactly. Although some of the traditions about who pays for what in a wedding and who's supposed to pay for what and who's supposed to give gifts to whom are in some ways a perpetuation of some of those ideas about marriage. So again, actually, I would also say that in societies all over the world, the idea of getting married for love has become prevalent. This is something that a lot of people want to believe. But like I said, the idea that it should be the basis for getting married is a relatively recent one in our life. I want to mention something else about marriage, which is that the ideas here that are super interesting from anthropology of endogamy and exogamy. And this is basically the idea that well, let's start with exogamy. Exogamy is that you have to marry outside of a certain group. And so, for example, all societies have rules and ideas about what kind of people who are related to you that you cannot marry close kin. And this is called the incest taboo, which means you're not supposed to get married to people who are closely related to you. But other people extend that out more to be, the idea that you shouldn't get married to anyone in your town or your group, that you have to get married to someone outside of a certain group, outside of a certain last name, for example. So this is the idea that you have to get married outside or exogamous to a certain group, certainly to your close kin. The idea of endogamy, though, is that you want to marry someone who is within maybe a certain social circle, maybe a certain religion, maybe a certain ethnicity. So endogamy refers to rules about, well, you don't want to marry someone who's too different, too far away, because that will result in a bad match. So all societies some of them have this very formally defined as sort of who is it you're expected to marry. Now, here's my question to you. See how this question goes. In the United States, we say that our marriages are based on love, right? Love, we marry the person we love, and we can choose anybody. But there's a curious sociological fact about the United States, is that for the most part, almost all, there's some exceptions, almost all US marriages are social class endogamous. That is to say, the rich people end up marrying other rich people. The working class people end up marrying other working class people. Middle class people end up marrying other middle class people. It is very rare, relatively rare, in the United States to find people that are socially class different and married. So, question, how is it that if we are just following our hearts and doing whatever we wish, that we end up marrying people who are basically in our social class?
Is social class or race or
Well, in the United States, a social class can in some ways be, we'll talk about this in the next chapter on inequality. There is certainly a decent amount of overlap, a lot, between social class and race, but there are sort of, let's just say that social class does not have to correspond to race. There are certainly people of all races who are wealthy and people of all races who are working class. So it's not really race, although sometimes there's a decent amount of overlap. Well, let me put it to you this way. How do you find the person that you're going to marry?
I just heard it somewhere that many people search for other people that are just like them, like not too different from them.
Yeah, where are you going to find those people?
Where?
Yeah, John, where are you going to find your partner from?
Any like wealthy area? Yeah, depends on the area of the race.
Depends on the area. So the first thing that happens is, you know, you grow up in a certain neighborhood and you're with people who are generally of the same level because of the housing prices. And, you are basically in the same situation. So in general, we do this just through geography. Even if you're looking on a dating app, it's going to be someone nearby, right? Because that's how you're going to go on a date. It has to be someone who lives relatively close to you. So we do this a lot by geography, but there's another great way that we do this. How do we meet people from different zip codes in a romantic relationship, which is structured by social class? It's getting harder to do now that everybody's on Zoom instead of in the classroom. The wonderful way that we do this is the wonderful sorting mechanism of going to college. So when we bring people into a college, and if we bring them in, especially based on their test scores and things like that, which very often correlate to social class, we bring people together from different places that are nevertheless at the same social class level. And it's a wonderful time of romantic relationships. And wouldn't you know it, here I am from a zip code in Montana, and my wife is from a zip code in New Jersey. We meet in college and we discover that, hey, we're going to get married, but our parents are both basically in the same social class because almost all the people in that college are kind of from the same social class and the same social class trajectory. So these are some of the ways in which our lives are shaped, even though we say we're marrying whoever we love. And of course, people do all kinds of crazy things because people are good at being people. But in general, people tend to fall into these patterns. So, few final thoughts on how anthropology does kinship and marriage. So going back to the first class we did kinship on, was that on Thursday? The idea that was important from that class is that even if we have a sort of what we might call a blood or a biological or genetic relationship, you have to make that through acts, and you have to make that through your active participation. And so if we think about marriage as a way of organizing what we might think of as our biological or natural sex drives, then if we looked around the world, we would expect marriages to look pretty much the same. However, we see all kinds of different ways that people get married. And even in what we might call so-called traditional societies, there are different funny forms of marriage, like Evans Pritchard discovered among the New Era, like women getting married to each other, but then one of them would show up as patrilineal on the kinship charts, or being married to someone who was actually deceased in order to have that be part of the inheritance structure. So we have all kinds of different ways in which people get married and mate, and as we discussed in the sexuality chapter, do all kinds of funny stuff. And so that's why Lavenda and Schultz say that marriage is not, although we can try to define it, it's a process, it's flexible, it's something that people do and work at over their lives. And it fits in with our general idea about kinship, which I believe I mentioned at the very beginning, that there's a whole lot of different ways in which we reckon kin, in which we call people kin who are not kin, in which we distance ourselves from people who we think might be biologically related to us. And so it's not something that is simply a translation of our biology into culture, because our culture does all kinds of different things with it. And it's not something that we can say, aha, they have it right or they have it wrong. And as society gets smarter and smarter, as they get more developed, they're going to know different forms of kinship systems. So what we see here is a vast variety and diversity of ways that people reckon their kin. But we should know that when it comes to things like gender and sexuality, kinship and marriage, all of those are places in which we see potentials for not just difference, but for inequality. And we talked about that a little bit when we talked about gender, but that's what we're going to be talking about in the next chapter. And the question about social class endogamy was in some ways a preface for that, because all of these things that are part of our culture are also things that people have different opinions about within any given society. And so that's where we end up our chapter on kinship and marriage. For this class, I also asked you to watch the first 30 minutes of another film in the Disappearing World series. So we saw some Unca's Big Mocha, and this film, we only had to watch the most important part, I think, happens in the first 30 minutes. Here we have a different form of society. We have a herding society or a pastoralist society. So you get a glimpse of a kind of different economic and social system. And then we see a glimpse of a different kind of kinship reckoning system. So this is a pretty classic case of a patrilineal system where the inheritance and the rights to land are coming through the husband's line or the father's line. It's also an instance of a patrilocal society. So we see the bride leaving her own village in order to marry into and become a part of her husband's village. So this would be a patrilineal and a patrilocal society. We also get a glimpse of some polygyny here, because the husband they are taking on more than one wife. And so there's I think a fascinating scene there where the anthropologist is asking a group of women about, are you going to be jealous? And they say, no, we're not jealous, because we need the extra labor. We need somebody to clean up the muck and clean up and do these things. and you can't do it unless you have a co-wife. And so, you know, I mean, there's some there's it may not be sort of a universal idea, but they at least are explicitly saying that that this is a good thing for them to have this this extra support, or this extra the co-wife around. Also has some really interesting talk here about female circumcision, or what is also called in Lavenda and Schultz, female genital cutting. And in this film, we see an elder woman who is basically completely defending this as sort of their cultural tradition, and you know, there's no reason to be even concerned here. If you compare that though to the section on caring for infibulated women giving birth in Norway, pages 464 and 465, what's I think important here to compare is that what the anthropologist is saying in this situation is that the assumption that the women simply wanted to give birth in a certain way and not to receive certain forms of medical care because that would interrupt their what had been done to them culturally was actually the wrong assumption. And what the anthropologist is saying there is that just because one person, or just because some people in a society might be defending a practice, that doesn't mean that everyone agrees with that practice. That doesn't mean you shouldn't sort of take the idea of cultural relativism. That doesn't mean you just say, oh, whatever they do, that's fine. It's a means of sort of getting into, okay, why might people do this? But you always want to kind of understand that just because people are part of another culture doesn't mean that everyone is on the same page about agreeing with everything that happens in that society. And so what our little text box says here is some of these women actually wanted a different form of medical care, but because the midwives were kind of saying, oh no, that's their culture, they wouldn't want to change that, there was a miscommunication about the kind of medical care that could be delivered. This is something we'll be talking about when we talk about medical anthropology and applied anthropology. It's just always really important to not necessarily fall into this idea that people in a society are completely captivated and determined by that culture. And so that's why I asked you this question, because if you looked at in the old days, I had a video of this with a little description of it, and it said, you know, these women are completely powerless. They're completely powerless from the confines of their culture. And it may be, I mean, there's certainly I'm not going to argue that the women are in control here, but it certainly seems to be, even if you look at the film itself, there certainly seems to be a lot of women who are running a lot of things. There seems to be some people who have some advantages, even though they're women in this society. You know, and even in a strictly patrilineal system, you can become a valued person. It may not be fair by becoming sort of an elderly mother with a lot of sons. Now, this is, again, not necessarily a solution to this, but you should always be aware that in a society, there are going to be different perspectives on what is going on. And so, again, when we talk about inequality and medical practices, it's super important to think about that a society or a culture always has a lot of variation within it and a lot of difference of opinion, and that sometimes what is the dominant view is also there's a counterbalanced view that may simply be unexpressed because they don't have the same amount of power. So that's what we're going to be talking about soon.